Thanks, Will. Those are some great reminders. Ways to say yes, ways to tap into our joy and our creativity, which may seem opposite to when talking about boundaries, right? Because sometimes we think about boundaries as limits and limitations rather than invitations. This month we've been spending our time thinking and reflecting on invitation. And at the beginning of the month, the first Sunday, I asked a couple of questions. I asked if we could imagine ways that we can create a space here or in other places in our lives and in our world where we feel like our full and our whole selves are welcome and invited. And here in the congregation, doing that not only when people are new, but when we've been here for months or for years, how do we continue to invite ourselves and invite each other and be welcomed again and again? And for those that were here a couple weeks ago, part of what my response to those questions were to think about how we embrace our humanness, how we embrace our individual complexity, the beauty of our imperfections, the acceptance and even beauty of our brokenness, and ways that we can hold ourselves and others gently, in the words of the poet Martha Postlewaite, in our own cupped hands. You may recall that poem called Clearing, and we're going to revisit it again, that says, "Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize it and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue." Today I'm going to spend time on that line and that idea of creating a clearing in the dense forest of our life. Dr. Sarah Gilman, who's a therapist and a psychologist and author who specializes in trauma and in boundaries, says we write the journey of our lives with what we say yes to and what we say no to. We write the journey of our lives in what we say yes to and what we say no to. That saying yes and that saying no are the boundaries that we create. It's how we create a clearing in the dense forest of our life. So many of us in our lives may not have learned ways to set boundaries that are caring and healing for ourselves or for others. We tend to maybe set boundaries when we've gotten to that point where we've just had it up to here, when I'm as mad as hell and I can't take it anymore. And part of what our relearning and unlearning is to learn that boundaries aren't there just for when we've had it up to here and can't take it anymore. They're a kindness that we provide to ourselves, a kindness that we provide to others. I like to put in front of there, just as a reminder to talk about boundaries as compassionate boundaries. It's not a original idea. It's one I stole from Brene Brown. Brene Brown says, compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to, and when they say yes, they mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. Those boundaries as kindness. Those boundaries as invitations, not limitations. Invitations that help us to invite us to be safer, to be braver, to be freer in our individual lives and in the ways that we connect in our congregations. And so I want to start with the sacred yes, Because often we think of boundaries as the things we say no to, but boundaries are also the things we choose to say yes to. Danny Wallace is a British humorist who had an experience that, in a book that he wrote, that got loosely turned into the movie Yes Man. The movie and the book are kind of apples and oranges, though. But Danny Wallace, he had an experience where he was sitting next to a stranger on a bus, and he had a period of time where he was feeling depressed, and he just found himself often just isolating and saying no to things, and that saying no had just become a habit. And the person he was talking with on the bus said that he thought that one of the secrets of happiness was saying yes more often. And so Danny thought, well, I'm not really good at saying yes, so I'm just going to say yes to everything. I'm going to say yes all the time. Anything that's offered, any challenge, any opportunity that comes up, I'm going to say yes to it. And then he, put some boundaries on it and said, okay, I'm not going to do anything illegal. I'm not going to do anything that would hurt somebody else. I'm not going to do anything that would be catastrophic, have a catastrophic impact, a permanent catastrophic impact on my life. But he ended up saying yes to a whole host of things. Found himself at a meeting with people who believed that UFOs formed the pyramids. Had a long conversation with a door-to-door window salesman that was selling him the exact same windows that he already had. Accepting flyers, and he kept a journal along the way. And so some of the stories, being a humorist, are very funny, but it's sprinkled in are different insights, things that he learned about saying yes. Things like saying, he says, probably some of the best things that ever happened to you in life happened because you said yes to something. Otherwise, you just sort of stay the same. That saying yes often leads to unexpected and wonderful adventures. He says your comfort zone can be a cage. And so we say yes to break free and experience new things. That life begins at the end of our comfort zone. Saying yes builds bridges and connects you to people and opportunities. And at the end, even though there were some of the things that seemed silly or things that he might not have done before and may never do again, when he was looking back on the year, he said, the fact that saying yes has not been a pointless exercise at all. It's been pointful. It had the power to change lives and set people free. It had the power of adventure. Sometimes it's the little opportunities that fly at us each day that have the biggest impact. Saying yes is a commitment to living life at the fullest. Now, some of what that speaks to is thinking about and recognizing the difference between what's a boundary and what's a barrier. There are some barriers that we accept because they feel comfortable or we're used to them or we're afraid of what would happen if we stepped outside of that barrier, that comfort zone. And so that differentiating between true safety, which is an important thing, and comfort and conformity, between safety and what's just the habit of saying no. But the other thing that happened with Danny over the course of that year is that he recognized that he had a different appreciation for no. And so he also wrote, saying no is power. No says, I'm in charge. Think about how many times you've said yes in the past year and how many times you would have liked to have said no instead. Maybe being able to say no is the one thing that keeps us sane. Some people go through their whole lives saying yes over and over again. Yes to things they don't want to do but feel obliged to do. Yes to things that allow other people to take advantage of them, just because that's the way things are. the way things have always been. Some people need to learn how to say no, because every time they say yes, they say no to themselves. So we have the sacred yes that stretches us beyond our comfort zone, but that no, there's that sacred no. How does our sacred no help us be safer and braver and freer? Part of it is when we practice that sacred no, our no can help us make more space for the things that we want to say yes to, that we don't take time to say yes to. Our sacred no can be an important part of our self-care and rest. I'm a big fan of Teresa Hershey, who started a ministry in Atlanta called the Nap Ministry and wrote a book called Rest is Resistance. And part of what she's pushing for in that book is a little bit of a cultural shift in the way that we think about rest. That she argues that sometimes we only rest when we've hit the point of exhaustion, when we don't have any choice but to rest. We rest because we feel like we've earned it. We rest because we rest so that we can do more work. And what she encourages us to think about instead is to think about rest as a basic human need, as a sacred right, as something that we give ourselves because we're worthy of it. And it doesn't have to be rest for the sake of being able to produce more. It's rest for the sake of giving ourselves rest. And it doesn't have to be justified. It's part of our inherent worth. And so part of that, our sacred no that we might think about if we're not doing it already, is thinking about where we set up Sabbath for ourselves during days or during the week or during the month, or taking a social media Sabbath, taking a break from that for a while. And when we practice that sacred no, when we create that space for ourselves, often, especially in community, when we start making space for ourselves, we're often making space for others, because we're not taking up quite as much space ourselves. That sacred no is also a generous no. So there's very much our individual boundaries, but when all of us get together, boundaries are very relational. They're about what my boundaries are, what your boundaries are. In the movie Dirty Dancing, there's a number of scenes where Patrick Swayze's character Johnny and Baby, Jennifer Grey's character, are rehearsing dancing. And in one of the scenes where they're dancing together, Johnny gets very frustrated with the fact that Baby is continuing to enter into his space. And he stops and he says, "Look, spaghetti arms, this is my dance space. This is your dance space. I don't go into yours, you don't go into mine. You got to hold the frame." Which is a nice way, I think, of thinking about boundaries in relationship. What's the frame that we're creating? And what is it that we each bring into that? And I like that image of that holding the frame being part of a dance, because it reminds us that boundaries aren't things that are there to separate us. They're invitations to connect. When we have those expectations and limitations in our relationships, we're letting other people know how they can connect with us. And when we listen to that from other people, we're paying attention to how we can connect with them. We eliminate that impossible task of trying to reach each other's minds. When somebody sets a boundary with us, they're basically letting us know, I care enough about this relationship to have this potentially really awkward conversation with you. It can be tricky. It can be challenging. There's lots of reasons why we can sometimes ignore our sacred yes and our sacred no and keep those things to ourselves. And chances are, if we are keeping those things to ourselves and we're not paying attention to our own boundaries or practicing having those conversations and setting boundaries, it also becomes very difficult to accept and understand other people's boundaries as well. There's lots of reasons why this is true. It can be our own fear of rejection and how people may respond to us. Maybe that we have a tendency, I fall into this one, wanting to please other people. Some of us are people pleasers. It can be having unrealistic expectations of ourselves or of other people. Our own anxiety or our own sense of shame about who we are or the boundaries that we need can sometimes get in the way, keep us from recognizing that sacred yes or no, keep us from lifting up and saying those things out loud. And the trauma that we experience in our lives impact these things immensely. Our own trauma, the intergenerational trauma that has been part of some of our families, cloud our sense of what's a good yes and what's a good no. And then there's just cultural norms themselves. We have some really challenging cultural norms that make us where we really have to step back and really reflect and really engage in some uncomfortable conversations. So part of our sacred yes is what types of discomfort am I intentionally saying yes to and why? Example of that is getting engaged in anti-racism work, right? If we get engaged in anti-racism work, that part of what we do as part of that work is thinking about the ways that we ourselves have internalized white supremacy culture, the ways we've internalized racism, even on an unconscious level, and sometimes recognizing that and thinking about it and talking about it is uncomfortable. And so it's important for us to have those safer and braver and freer spaces where we can do that work. Hopefully that's work we're able to do together here so that we can do it more effectively out there, right? That it makes us better partners, better allies, better at the work that we do in the world. This past spring, some of us participated in a course from the Transforming Hearts Collective that was around transgender inclusion in congregations. And one of the activities that we did was we looked at what were the characteristics of dominant U.S. culture, what were some of the characteristics of UU culture, and what were some of the characteristics of trans culture, and then we compared them and went, oh, as much as we hate to admit it, some of the characteristics of UU culture have more in common with dominant culture than they do with trans culture. And so, what do we do that helps us be safer and braver and freer? That we sit with some of that discomfort. That we come into this space as learners and setting aside some of what we don't know that we're all entering these topics at different points and with different experiences and with different things that we need to learn. And in talking through the difference between intention and impact, that we're able to do that without a sense of blaming or shaming, or if we do feel shame, that we just own it and work it through, right? It requires a lot of vulnerability, a lot of humility, and a lot of vulnerability. And it's okay for us to have feelings. We're engaged in these types of conversations and these kind of work. So, when we engage in creating these braver spaces, our braver spaces actually do help create safer spaces. There's an example of that many of us have experienced in our lifetime. For some of us are old enough to remember when the term sexual harassment didn't exist, because that term was first coined in 1975. And for those of us that were around during that time, we'll remember that often, like other new terms or new ideas or new concepts, when they're introduced into the popular culture, people aren't just waiting and going, "Oh, thank you, I've been waiting to hear about that. I'm really excited to learn about this." There was a lot of resistance, and some of that still continues to this day. We see it in our current political climate and some of the discussions that are happening. But it hasn't been that long. 1975 till now is a blink. But for some of us in our work environments, we've had those conversations, right? How do we create a workspace that feels safe? What are some of the norms that we establish so that sexual harassment is not part of our work environment? And it can be tempting for us in our congregations, in our church life, to think, well, that's not something that can happen here. But we know that it does. It happens in church denominations of all kinds, including Unitarian Universalist congregations. And so there's some boundaries that are not negotiable. There's some that are steadfast, some that need to be there to ensure the safety and the bravery of all. So as I'm saying these things, if you find that this is lifting some experiences that you have been feeling confused about or unsure of whether to talk about, whether it's sexual harassment or it's other forms of harassment or other forms of just boundaries that just don't quite feel right, that I'm not making sense of. Either I'm not quite feeling like my boundaries are being respected, or I'm just not sure whether this is the discomfort around this boundary is an okay discomfort or a discomfort that I should try to create some boundaries around. I don't always have the perfect answers to those kind of questions. I don't always have the perfect response, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to help process. I'm willing to help find resources, and I would be honored to be engaged in that conversation and to talk through and reflect what individually can help us be safer, be braver, and be freer in our own lives and in our congregations. In our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, we have a shared covenant, our sacred promise to ourselves and one another for how we want to be together, that states, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." Those are beautiful words. Those are challenging words. It's not always easy to find love at the center. It takes both our sacred yes and our sacred no. It takes the personal and shared risks of being safer, of being braver, of being freer. And so may each of us together hold love in the center of who we are. May we practice compassionate boundaries with ourselves and one another. And may we create a clearing in the dense forest of our lives and wait there patiently until the song that is our life falls into our own cupped hands and we recognize it and greet it. May it be so, and may we make it so.